Learning to let go is a practice I think that we can all agree needs to be learned over and over again.
Today, we've got a great friend of mine who I've known for almost 30 years, a guy named Curt Llewellyn. Curt is the director of the Center for Innovation at the Fessenden School. He's an educator, a coach, just a super curious guy who got into meditation in high school, but then really started practicing it later in his life. So I know you're going to get a lot of great things out of it. You're going to enjoy hearing the conversation with Curt. And thanks again for joining. All right. Well, Curt, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us here on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So you and I have gone back, we go back a lot of years, and I think you were one of the first guys to really kind of get into meditation. I know this podcast is really about yoga, but obviously meditation is probably the bigger opportunity for those people who do have a yoga practice, and many of them probably aren't quite at that level. But your practice is really about meditation. So I'm looking forward to hearing your path with that practice. And I guess a great place to start would be, how did you get into it? Where were you in your life? And, what brought you to meditation?
Yeah. So when you initially asked me, to do a podcast talking about yoga, I was hesitant because my yoga practice is novice at best. But when it comes to mindfulness and meditation, those are things that I've had a pretty solid practice in for over 20 years. And my initial exposure to it was actually in high school. I can't recall if it was sophomore or junior year, but I went to a boarding school and was taking a religious studies class with one of my lacrosse teammates. It was kind of just a generic religious studies class. And the teacher was somebody who was also a mindfulness and meditation instructor. And she invited students of her class, and I think even others, to come down on Saturday mornings and do a little yoga stretching into meditation. And this teammate of mine, both, she mentioned that it was good for athletes. And this was back in the 90s. This was kind of pre Tom Brady and others who were espousing things like yoga and mindfulness. And so we were skeptical probably, but we were intrigued. We went, and I think that was the only time we did it, just this one Saturday morning. But I remember having a pretty profound experience, enjoying it quite a bit, coming out feeling really relaxed. There was a bit of a stigma probably back then. You and I have talked a lot about the sort of fading stigma about things like mindfulness, meditation, and yoga itself. But yeah, so I want to say there were probably 15 to 20 students there with this teacher. It was probably a 40-minute session, something like that.
What about it drew you to it? I mean, there was got to be something that was like a hook or some kind of curiosity. You were like, why not? Why not check this out?
Yeah, I mean, I think she had talked about it in terms of athletes and performance. So I think that was one of the hooks that got us. She was a super cool teacher. I think, we both enjoyed the class she taught. And so I think those are probably the two primary reasons we were kind of interested in just going and checking it out. And so that was the initial exposure, I think, and that was what planted the seed for, what later on became a pretty solid practice for me.
Can you remember at all, perhaps in the beginning when you first started meditating, what you thought about it? Either sort of the awkward novelty of it or actually what you really enjoyed about it?
Probably mostly the difficulty. I remember thinking, this is really hard, right? And that's in my experience, that's what most people's experience is like at the start, that it's difficult, right? Meditation, often many Buddhist philosophers, talk about the fact that meditation is simple but not easy. And so I think I remember finding it difficult and thinking, boy, my mind wanders a lot. But also, as I said, I also remember having this distinct feeling of being relaxed and calm when I left. And I think a lot of that had to do with the stretching and just, the peace, the quiet.
So moving forward, finishing your high school experience and then going into college, did you kind of continue to do meditation, or was this sort of something that you kind of did once in a while?
That was literally just kind of a one-off experience. And I definitely did not really even return. I definitely read some things about Eastern philosophy in high school and in college, but it wasn't until after graduating college that I had a kind of profound experience that shifted things for me. And that was that I was living in Boston and was working locally, walking to work and things like that. And
is this for the financial services industry, or is this for known brands on Newbury Street?
Ironically, it was kind of between things. I had quit my job in the finance industry, just kind of figured out that suits and elevators wasn't the gig for me. I hadn't quite figured out what I wanted to do next. So I was working at the Patagonia store, as you mentioned, on Newbury. I was riding my bike to work and trying to figure out, what to do next. It was a kind of an in-between moment for me. And ultimately, as you mentioned, I turned to education as a career. But I was out for a run one evening and was actually stretching on the Charles, the docks down on the river. And I literally threw my back out to the extent that I remember like barely being able to limp back to my apartment. And I think in hindsight, a lot of that was stress related because I was contemplating a pretty major career change. And I was given the book Healing Back Pain by Dr. John Sarno. And he's been touted by Howard Stern, among others. And he's somebody who, writes pretty extensively about the mind-body connection. And it took me a few reads, but having read this book, I kind of was like healed. And a lot of what he talks about has to do with stress and how stress can find its way into your physical body in ways. And so that really sort of changed things for me. And I remember, after reading that book and after sort of recovering from that injury, starting a practice pretty solidly, meaning at that time, probably, every other day or something like that. Which eventually turned into a practice where I do simple, sun salutations in the morning into a meditation practice anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes.
Yeah. And so you weren't necessarily doing yoga, at least in the eyes and ears of what people consider yoga these days. It really was a meditation practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Any yoga that I've done has been, pretty amateur. My wife is a much more experienced yoga practitioner than me. And my practice is really lending itself to loosening my body so that I can sit in Zazen in the morning and sometimes in the evening as well. But initially when that back injury started, it was about stretching. And I remember reading quite a bit, in Dr. Sarno's book and then others, that stretching was key. There were things that were happening to my physical body that was causing the pain, but the stress and the way that that stress kind of found itself into the body was what actually, caused me to throw out the back. So yoga was aiding my meditation, I think, as much as the other way around.
And I think that the part about John Sarno, his whole thing about the tense muscle syndrome or whatever he called it, I think that's it's such a huge discovery for so many people to realize their bodies and their minds are just holding just an absolute ton of tension, and it manifests in weird ways it manifests in the heart and the mind and, in your whole body. And I think being able to unhook or at least acknowledge that there's all this tension you're holding, you have no idea that you're doing it. And then being able to, over time, get really good to let that tension go. Like you get better at learning how to let that tension go pretty quickly.
For sure. That's what a meditative practice is all about. It's all not the time that you're spending on the mat, but how it affects, your overall life. And so learning in those moments how to just sort of release that tension. You mentioned, I have another good friend who struggled with some serious lower back pain injury and was unable to play golf for years. And I sent him the book, and I can't remember if I heard back from him initially. I think maybe I did, and just, was still struggling with back pain and wasn't playing golf. And it was years later. I don't remember how many, but, something like 4 or 5 years later, I remember getting this long, super nicely written email saying, he finally was kind of just frustrated and read the book one more time. And for whatever reason, it's, struck a chord with him. And, I think a lot of people think of they literally just hear that name, healing back pain or a mind body connection. And they think that it's some kind of woo woo, quack science. Dr. Sarno is Harvard trained. This is based in real science. And so, I think it may take, longer for certain people to kind of wrap their head around that. But yeah, I get this email basically saying, he's playing golf, he's running, he's doing all the things that he had once been able to do, but was unable because of the injury. So yeah, it takes a different amount of time for different people to kind of settle into a practice where they see meaningful change about the release of the tension and those sorts of things.
Yeah. And do you lie down or do you sit, or what's your posture when you do meditate?
Yeah. So I sit just cross-legged on like a Zafu cushion. We have yoga mats in the house. So I usually do a little bit of stretching, usually just like some tunes on, some reggae tunes or something like that. And then, I sit, I use various, meditative apps just to time it, usually with a bell at the start and a bell at the finish, but pretty straightforward.
And have you noticed sitting on a cushion, do you find that your back is actually stronger from having gotten used to sitting over time and maintaining healthy posture? Because if you don't have good posture, it's just going to wail on you.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned I work in a school, and not as much now, but I used to work even more with some of our younger students. And so sitting, cross-legged on the floor, is not a rare occurrence. And there's no doubt about it. I remember at one point listening to, it was actually a meditation instructor from one of the podcasts that I listened to. And she talked about the analogy of an avocado. You want it to be perfectly ripe. You want your back to be firm enough that, it's, holding your neck and your shoulders properly. But you want to be relaxed enough as well. So this kind of, middle ground where, as you say, the more you practice it, the more it becomes the natural posture when you take your seat.
Yep. And when you sit to meditate, like how long do you usually on average sit when you meditate?
Yeah, it's basically anywhere from 5 minutes to 40 minutes. And some of that has to do with, schedule. I try to make it a common practice. So I really try and carve out at least 20 minutes every morning. And it's roughly, I'd say, a half an hour to 40 minutes from the stretching to the sitting. And I do that, as I say, primarily every morning. And once in a while, I'll sit in the evening as well.
When you say every morning, do you have a certain time that you hit it early on?
Yeah. A lot of my practice is based in Zen Buddhism. So a routine is definitely a part of this. So, I try and get up at the same point every morning to do my practice. One of the books that I've read most recently is a book called Why Buddhism is True by Robert Wright. And it was a book based on an article in the Wall Street Journal that I had read. And so, a lot of people are certainly, not so familiar with the Buddhist aspect to this. So mindfulness is the word that I would definitely use more. And TM, transcendental meditation, is something that's becoming more and more common. And, it's a very secular approach to the same practice, which is, sitting quietly and not trying to do away with thoughts, but just placing attention on thought.
Yep. You've been doing this for a number of years now. Have you noticed how quickly or how easily you can drop into that place you want to get to?
Yeah, it's a slow progression, but yes, I think of it. I've been doing this, that running episode that I talked about was probably 25 years ago, something like that. So I've been doing this for a long time, and it's very slow progression, but yes, certainly, at this point, it's much easier for me to sort of recognize if I'm tensing up or if there's any stress and relaxing right in the moment. And that's the goal of this, right? It's not to say, hey, I can sit and meditate for X amount of minutes a day. It's to see what impact it has on your sort of relaxed nature outside of or off the cushion.
And so in working with both younger men, sort of, and maybe speak for a moment a little bit about your role at the Fessenden School.
Yeah. So, I teach in the Innovation Center, as you say. We have laser cutters and 3D printers. It's a really creative space. You've been in there. It's an awesome space, and it's buzzing with activity. So what's required of me on any given day a lot is my attention. And it's coming from multiple, angles, lots of different students who are looking for technical help on different things, and being able to relax into that sort of creative chaos and just enjoy the moments and know that, if you can't get to help this particular student in this moment, assuring them that you'll find the time to do that, and sort of, creating that atmosphere of relaxedness, because there's certainly a lot of excitement with the creative aspect to my job, but also sort of combining that with, an attitude, a vibe, if you will, that's relaxed and has people really sort of being their creative best. So I apply those practices in sort of tangential ways. Then there are some kind of specific moments. I always remember one. I was working with a bunch of third grade students. This was years ago, probably 12 years ago. And they were all on Mac desktops at the time. And they were laggy. The internet was slow. Something was laggy. And so they were getting frustrated. And I remember saying to them, the computers can sense your anxiety. If you're stressed, they're going to be really slow. If you relax, you'll find that they're faster. And all these third grade kids are like, oh my God, it's working. Oh my God, it's working. And of course, that's like a Zen koan. It's like not, it was like not based in science really, but it was, your perspective, right? It's so they sort of had this experience where their shifted perspective allowed them to just, be much more relaxed with a stressful situation. I think it's a huge thing. I think in our modern lives these days is just knowing when you're impatient, and then all of a sudden just saying like, all right, I'm not going to be counting the seconds or the minutes here. It just, it'll happen when it happens, whatever you're waiting on, right? Elevator, someone to respond to an email, or just whatever it is. It's a huge thing to be able to have that control over whether or not you're even letting that delay, that lag affect you. And, it's like, it's a practice, like how, sometimes you're just impatient and you can't make that connection, but over time it's so much easier to do. Yeah, for sure. And we've talked a lot, you and I, about this, sort of it becoming more commonplace. So mindfulness and meditation, while it's not my role at the school, is something that's taught, a lot, starting at a very young age, where we've got like kindergarten students doing the snow globe exercise, where they kind of shake a snow globe that they've made and watch the little things that are inside slowly settle and just try and, focus their breath and do things like that to relieve stress. And certainly, our current circumstances have raised anxiety levels. So you hear and you see quite a lot of talk in schools now about mindfulness and meditation. And we were talking earlier, I was saying, my initial sort of path into this had to do with athletics and lacrosse specifically at the time. I coached lacrosse at the school I'm at right now. And last spring, we had our season canceled, but we did a lot of quote unquote practices where we'd hop on Zoom calls and do different things. One of the things we would do is have guest coaches or guest alumni players that are off in college or secondary school now playing. And one of the coaches we had on, in fact, two of the coaches, both one of the coaches from Deerfield Academy and the coaches from Belmont Hill, both mentioned that both, during the quarantine, the season that got canceled, but in prior seasons as well, yoga was a regular part of their practice.
Really?
Yeah. So to hear that, coming from these really elite, lacrosse programs to some of our youngest guys, it was like, okay, that's great. We're there, this is no longer stigmatized in any way.
So they're saying at these private school programs, they incorporate yoga as a part of their athletic training for the season, for the game, for practice, whatever.
Yeah, and they were saying it in the context of the season being canceled. So, I think it was the Belmont Hill guys that said two out of the 4 or 5 days that they were online, quote unquote, practicing together, they were doing yoga. So I think it had increased because everybody was home and it was something that you could do. But it was clear to me that, they believed in what yoga could do, in terms of your flexibility, your strength conditioning, all of those things. So, the fact that it was mentioned on 2 of those calls tells me that it's no longer, a stigmatized thing where it's like, oh, that's a woo-woo thing, or that's a thing for girls to do, but not athletes.
Yeah, and I totally get the younger generation, anyone who's in like a K through 9 or junior high or high school, those kids are getting exposed to this stuff early on. What's your sense about guys our age? I think we are probably good pals with some of the least mindful guys out there, depending on the hour. But what do you think about the guys in our age group, guys in their 40s and 50s? What do you sense as far as their interest and willingness and curiosity to start getting into this stuff?
Well, I think it's all over the map. I mentioned the story about a buddy of ours who had the back problem, and it took him a while, but now he's a strong believer in the mind-body connection. So I have to think there's some bit of a practice developing there, whether it's just stretching or perhaps sitting as well and things like that. And I've had conversations with, a bunch of our contemporaries who are, somewhere on the spectrum here, but as a whole, I would say, yeah, we're kind of right on that bubble. It was, as I said, it was probably pretty stigmatized in 1990 or 91 when I was going to that class. There wasn't a bunch of dudes there, that's for sure. So I would say, anybody in the age bracket just above ours, I think they're probably, if not skeptical, hesitant. And I don't know how experimental, I think as you say, the generation that's coming up right now, for sure, there doesn't seem to be any stigma, but the millennials and stuff like that, I see a lot of practice. So I'd say we're right on that sort of bubble age where, I wouldn't count against guys in our age group being into mindfulness and meditation. I know Jerry Seinfeld is a big proponent of TM, transcendental meditation, but yeah, I think it's far less common for guys in our age and certainly guys a little bit older.
So for guys who are listening to this show now, what would be your advice to them and the reasons why they should get into meditation?
Well, whether someone gets into meditation is, up to them. I think, staying limber, staying loose, staying relaxed is something that everybody's interested in. We talked about anxiety and, what are some of the things that you can do that will help your day-to-day, moment-to-moment be less stressful. I think that's usually the path into these practices is either some very acute moment, like my moment when I was out for my run, or, just a slowly building kind of tightening of the shoulders and things like that. So, my advice would be if any of those things ring a bell with you as your body begins to age and the stresses of work life and those sorts of things, that now is the time. You're never too old. That's for sure. The older they get, the more important these practices become, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think a lot of that anxiety and stress, especially as you get sort of through your midlife, there's just fewer things that are in your control. You have, you're sort of into the second set, so to speak. So there's not a whole lot. There's lots of time, but time is moving faster. And sometimes you might feel that your choices are not as many, or your ability to change the situation is less. And I think when you're feeling boxed in, you're feeling like, that you have less control. It's a perfect signal that, starting a practice, meditation or yoga or something is going to help you manage that in your mind, your body, and hopefully avoid other sort of health issues down the line from dealing with chronic stress. So I'm totally with you.
Yeah, learning to let go is a practice I think that we can all agree needs to be learned over and over again. And if there's something to be said for those old folks in our age bracket, there is some truth and wisdom in experience. And so I think there is a natural propensity for many of us to learn that lesson. Like it wasn't that big of a deal, whatever it was. So learning to be able to let that go and let the stresses, whether those are physical or mental, just, kind of roll off your back a little easier is something that is important for all of us for sure.
Absolutely. Well, Curt, this has been great. As always, I've enjoyed these conversations, and thanks for spending some time with us today.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. It's always fun, Derek.
All right, man. Be well.